Welcome to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. We're looking forward to a fascinating discussion today, recognizing that it is now 10 years since there's been a focus on protecting freedom of peaceful assembly and association worldwide. We'd like to make sure that everybody is on mute so that we don't have noise interference. Secondly, there is Spanish and French interpretation. Please scroll down to the bottom of the screen and click onto interpretation and choose the language of your choice. At this point, I'd like to turn to the panelists and to introduce them. Due to us ensuring that we have an interactive approach, I've given them the homework of introducing themselves very briefly, please, because we'd like to keep as much time as possible for interaction and answering questions. So I'm going to start with the Special Rapporteur. Monsieur Clement Voule, could you please introduce yourself? Could you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm Clement Voule, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association, and I took office in 2018. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Voule. Thank you for the correction. The second speaker will be Beatriz Perez. Beatriz, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Beatriz Perez. I'm the Executive Director of CEPAS, the Center of Justice and Peace. I'm from Venezuela, and it's a pleasure to be this morning sharing with you. Thank you.
Gracias, Beatriz. Over to you, Emerson. Please introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Emerson Sykes. I'm calling in from New York City. I'm a staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union, where I work on free speech and the right to protest. And before that, I was the legal advisor for Africa at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law.
Thank you. Welcome, Emerson. Thank you. We have Peter Mysic. If you'd introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Good morning. Where I am in New York City, I am general counsel and lead the legal arm at Access Now, a global organization that defends and extends digital rights and security of communities at risk. And I also am an adjunct professor at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, teaching on internet governance. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. We do have another panelist, Gift Trapens from Malawi, who's been having difficulty connecting. I don't know if Gift's been able to connect. If not, he will join us along the way. I'd like to start off now by firstly saying every single one of the speakers, including the Special Rapporteur, 5 minutes, please. We are going to be addressing the topic of COVID-19, social movements, and peaceful protests. I'd like to turn to you, Monsieur Voule, if you could share your statement with us. Could you please unmute, please? Thank you.
When you forget, start talking without unmuting yourself. Thank you very much, Alice, for giving me the floor. And I want also, first of all, to thank all of the panelists, but also those who are joining us currently to participate to this important webinar, which marks also the celebration of the 10 years of the creation of the mandate of UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association. I think, as you can see, this webinar aims also to kind of help us to really discuss about one of the critical aspects of the work of the Special Rapporteur, which is how to continue and to assist states in ensuring that states promote this fundamental right, which is peaceful assembly. Let me thank the organizer, the co-sponsor, including Switzerland, that will be speaking soon, CEPAS, and Access Now, and the International Service for Human Rights for their for really putting hands together to organize, but also to my team. I want to, I want also to emphasize that the right to peaceful assembly is a fundamental right protected by the Article 21 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And these rights empower civil society, groups, individuals, and communities to come out and express their view on issues or decisions affecting their life. And these rights was exercised, if we go back in the history, this right was exercised by many nations to gain their freedoms, such as the decolonization, as most of you know, the apartheid, and also, as we hear yesterday, the Czech Republic, for example, that's also highlighted, Ambassador highlights how this right was instrumental for the Czech Republic to gain their democratic freedom. And today than ever, this right is really important. And turn to the social movements. You need those movements that organize themselves, that stood up to say no, or those movements that stood up to say it's enough, those movements that stood up to change. And if you look at from the Tunisia revolution, to the Armenia revolution, to the Sudan revolution, and to Ethiopia revolution, and recently to the whole protests that happening around the racial discrimination that was led by the Black Lives Matter movements, you can see the importance of these rights and how this right help us really to change our destiny, to change, to shape our future. Then to these rights, a lot of movements emerging around the world are able to really show us the way to go, to challenge some of the decisions of the states that compromise their life or that puts in danger this planet. And I don't want to highlight the climate issue when we see the young people currently stooding up and turn to this right. They are able to tell us, no, it's important to change today. It's important that we listen to the critical situation that the planet is going around this planet. So this right is not just at the political level, you know, it's also the right that help communities to empower. Yes, this right help also political parties to be able also to connect with their supporters, to be able also to compete, to be able also to campaign. So you can see that this right is fundamental right. The right to protest is the substance of the society. In the society where people are not able to come out, to express themselves freely, to say what they think about the government policy, this society cannot claim themselves to be a democratic society, cannot claim themselves to be a peaceful society, because the society prevents people to be able to express themselves, to be able to be citizens, to be able also to participate in the public life. So this right is a fundamental right that I think we need to continue to protect. And this right, let me also be clear that this right is subject to the limitation only narrowly defined by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Yes, states may resort to the limitation of this right on the ground of national security or public safety, public order, the protection of the health, moral, or the protection of the rights and freedom of other. And any limitation to these rights must be proportionate. It must be provided by the law. And it must also be necessary in any democratic society, meaning that the limitation of these rights may not aim to really destroy the right itself, the exercise itself. From what we are seeing today, that some of the limitations are aiming only to prevent people to exercise this. And the covenant is clear on that you cannot limit this right because you don't want people to exercise them. And for me, it's important to. So some of the challenges that we witnessed during these 10 years that the mandate was working to try to promote this right, to try to promote the better understanding of this right. For example, one of the problems that we saw is the law that criminalized the protests. I don't want to go in detail because I know that we'll be discussing. And then also the question of the authorization versus notification regime, where, for example, some countries feel like these rights, people can need to ask authorization before they exercise. We are saying, no, this is the fundamental right. People can notify the state, but people cannot ask authorization before they exercise their fundamental rights. We also see the mass surveillance today that is led by the new technology where the government is surveying a mass protest and prevent people to be able to go to the protest because they know that somebody is watching to them or they're gathering their data. We saw also the excessive use of force. The internet shut down to prevent people to protest. Whenever we have election and after the election, whenever people want to go on the street to manifest or to ensure that people understand their discount, we have also the internet shutdown. And we need to prevent all of this. And during these 10 years, the mandate was working on some of these challenges, preventing that. I want also to highlight also that the current COVID situation also increased this restriction. And we saw the emergency of the national, we saw the emergency of the emergence of security law or the emergency law that give broad power to the government. And some of the measures taken by the government based on this power are not aiming really to address the public health. While I recognize that many governments are trying to do their best to mitigate the impact of COVID, but you can see that many governments also use the COVID as a pretext to restrict the right for people to protest. And I'm sure many people will talk about that here. But I want also to say that at the international level, we have also some good since these 10 years. For example, based on this restriction that we are seeing COVID-19, I draft the 10 principles that aiming to protect the enjoyment of this right during the COVID time. We saw also that the mandate also provide states with the 10 principles of management of the assembly, and also the guideline on the least lethal weapon that we can come back and talk. And then recently, the committee also that is working on Article 21 of the Covenant, which will provide further guidance of the states on how they can really mitigate or they can really manage or enforce this right. And I want to also to end to say that at the domestic level, we are also seeing that many states now are moving from the authorization regime to the notification regime, which is really good. And we saw that during this COVID time also, some of the national court, I'm sure Gift will be talking about that, were able also to really rule against the lockdown when the lockdown is not in line with the Constitution. And we saw the recent decision of the German court, which said that preventing the protest is disproportionate and that the local governments will take necessary measures to ensure that while people are continuing to protest, they observe the minimum rules in terms of health security. I just wanted to end there and thanking all of you and hope that this panel will also provide us opportunity to say, how do we move forward in future in protecting this right and ensuring that our right to come together, to voice our opinion is protected for the future of this planet. Thank you very much, Alice.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Voule. I'd now turn to Beatriz Perez, who will be addressing the question of, we're aware that freedom, peaceful assembly and association, Beatriz, are essential, as a special rapporteur has said, to the existence of not only democracy, but also equality and freedom, as well as sustainable development. But we do know, as the rapporteur said, denial of these freedoms tends to lead to marginalization of groups, which in turn leads to an exacerbation of major global problems. So I'd like to ask you, what have you seen as having been the impact of these severe restrictions he's spoken about in terms of organizing and participating in peaceful protests? What has been that impact, particularly on marginalized communities and on women? Thank you. Over to you, Beatriz. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Special Rapporteur, for this opportunity. And for me, my intervention is going to be focused on Latin America, but also in Venezuela. That is where we work. And Latin America is one of the most unequal regions in the world, and is an exponential phase of the pandemic right now. And there is a very huge difference in the effect of the COVID-19 between the higher and lower income sectors in the region. Disadvantaged groups have not been able to express their demands and needs, and the states have been insufficient to address the need of low-income communities. The economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic will leave more than 11.5 million new unemployment. in 2020 in whole Latin America, which increased the total number of unemployed people to 37.6 million. Unfortunately, poverty and extreme poverty in Latin America will increase in all the countries. The main causes of the protests in Latin America are for social protections and freedom of movement. Low-income people were not prepared for quarantine. Poor people live day by day. More in Venezuela, that we face a complex humanitarian emergency. Several Latin American countries are using the pandemic to adopt more restrictive measures to stop social protests. It is an issue as a tool, or this is a use as a tool to justify the violation of rights and freedoms. A clear example is what is happening also in Venezuela, attack to disproportionate use of force in protest. Also, something good is there is a new tactics of protest. For example, in Colombia, you can see red flags hanging from windows, and this is a very strong symbol of poverty and hunger, a symbol of protest. And so they display large banners on buildings. Also, we saw in Chile, firemen from all over the country sounded their sirens to oppose to the state cut budgets. Most of the Latin American countries have applied something that we call cacerolazos, is pot-banging protests against the measures taken by each state of the state during the quarantine. This is happening in the most of the country in Latin America, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. Although this is not an innovative form of protest, has been the most frequently used during the quarantine. Although the virus has the characteristic of being easily spread and infect people, people has not stopped mobilizing in the street, which is a sign of people's vulnerability and the need, for most part, to demand better economic conditions in which to live. An example of this is also Venezuela. And let me give you some numbers. In May, we have, in March, we have 580 protests in Venezuela, according to the Observatory of Conflict. On April, we have 716 protests. And on May, we have 1,075 protests, more than 2,300 protests during the first 3 months of the pandemic. And you see how restrictions that arise as a consequence of the pandemic, such as quarantine or mandatory isolation, directly affect the right to peaceful assembly. And these restrictions should be carried out under the principle of proportionality and for limited time. But the restriction must be justified and carried out through available legal channels. But the reality is that radical and disproportionate restrictions violate the human right to peaceful assembly and movement in Latin America and in Venezuela. Alternative wave of assemblies and protests we saw in the digital world are booming and show us the importance of the digital space for the right to freedom of expression. But marginalized communities doesn't have access to this, the connection of internet. And in the case in Venezuela, we must emphasize that not only is violence used against people who do not comply with the quarantine, but also those who use social network as a way to protest and demanding right. There are people victims of regime persecution with arbitrary arrests, raids, threats, and harassment. In our organization, we just registered at least 92 journalists who has been victims of persecution in the first quarter of the quarantine. In this sense, Latin America, the most marginalized populations, is in conditions of pre-existing vulnerabilities. State policies focus on the different impact of the pandemic on women, children, migrants, and disadvantaged groups are needed. In this sense, decisions must be made to allow access or equal access to health service and sexual and reproductive rights. Women still working and organizing and also working against violence against gender, but we need to be protected in our work. the state have not protected the precarious condition of life that is now deepening. And furthermore, in this context, with the impossibility of exercising the right to protest, which is not only limited, but completely suppressed. They cannot make, people cannot make their petition, claims, and demands to the authorities to obtain an effective exercise of their rights. Emergency health measures cannot restrict the right to protest. By using health measures, it should be possible to give people the right to demonstrate, because they are the only way for societies to confront the government. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Gracias, Beatriz. Just to remind colleagues who may have just joined us, there's an interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen. Please do click on that if you need interpretation for Spanish and for French or for English. I'd now like to turn to Emerson. We're aware that the role of civil society, as well as communities, has been really central to peaceful approaches to solving problems through the exercise of the freedom of peaceful assembly and association. And of course, our history is replete with examples of that. I'm from Southern Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, anti-slavery movement, the women's movement, as well as what is going on right now with the anti-racism movement, which appears to be going global. And I'd like to ask you whether we can find a way of understanding how marginalized communities can be empowered and supported, particularly during this particularly challenging time, not only because of COVID-19, but in terms of the socioeconomic upheavals which are currently ongoing. Thank you, Emerson. 5 minutes, please.
Sure, I've started my timer. Thank you, Alice. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. There's so much one can say. As you know, I'm an attorney, so my framework is always through the law, but I'll try not to be too myopic in my approach. But as you mentioned, the context, and especially here in the United States, after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis by a police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck, we saw this explosion of protests, not first starting in Minneapolis and then spreading across the United States. And as you mentioned, now we've seen it across the world. We've also seen specialized protests for Black trans lives, for Black women's lives, for Black children's lives. And it's really been inspiring to be in the streets and seeing all of these people giving voice to these concerns, to this pain, to this rage, but also to this optimism. And we've seen that a window of opportunity is opening. As much as 2020 feels like the biggest disaster we could imagine, at the same time, we have seen movement on issues we never thought we would see movement on. And so as much as this feels like a very new moment, new energy, new slogans, there are also some very old issues that we're trying to confront. And so some of the ways that we're trying to empower organizations and individuals at the ACLU is first by doing Know Your Rights trainings, doing videos, doing webinars like this one. Some of these issues are really difficult. They're very complicated. The legal ins and outs of what is allowed and what is not allowed in a protest is not obvious to everybody. And so we think it's really important, especially in a movement like this, where a lot of people are taking to the streets for the first time. We're seeing these are not only seasoned activists who are taking to the streets. This is massive, massive mobilization. So it's important for people to know their rights. It's important for people to understand the risks that are involved in going into the streets. And so we really hope that we can empower people with that knowledge to make decisions for themselves, whether they decide to go out to a protest, whether they decide to engage in civil disobedience, or because of COVID or any other sorts of issues, they decide that they need to take action from home. And there are all sorts of ways that people can take action without going into the streets. Some of the issues that we've really been confronting, some of the big questions that people have had are around interactions with the police during a protest. If they try to break up the protest, what's the proper protocol for obeying police orders? What if those police orders are unlawful themselves? We know that police make all sorts of demands that are not in line with the law. And also people are cutting to these second and third level questions about what's the most responsible way to take photographs at a protest in order to protect people's privacy without removing their agency. So we've really invested a lot of time and effort into these Know Your Rights trainings, and I think it's time well spent because not everybody really understands the legal framework for massive mobilization. Another thing we've been doing at the ACLU is trying to make sure that the rules are constitutional. You know, we have a system where we have a central government that's relatively weak, and then obviously we have very strong states and even localities. Policing in the United States is done at the local level. We have thousands of police departments in the United States, and each of them have their own rules of engagement. So making sure that Clement mentioned before the difference between an authorization regime and a notification regime. Just today, I'm working on a case in a small little town called Graham, North Carolina, where they have an ordinance that says that anyone who wishes to gather to express any message must have a permit. So this is, you know, the epitome of a terrible authorization regime, which is unconstitutional. It's counter to international human rights law, but yet it exists in this county in North Carolina. So we're suing them to try to block this ordinance from being enforced. But one level even worse, they have this horrible permit regime, but they're also instituting states of emergency essentially every weekend and revoking all permits completely. So it's just an example, as Clement had said, not just of the authorization versus notification, but also the use of COVID and the massive mobilizations as a pretext to shut down dissent. And really in Graham, the issue is a Confederate monument at the center of town that many people, as a part of this big anti-racism push, and people have been calling for generations for this monument to be removed. And so we are trying to make sure that people have the right to take to the streets, to demand that these monuments are removed, to do so in a fair and peaceful way. I know I'm almost at time, but I just want to mention a couple of other examples. Very quickly, the ACLU has also brought lots and lots of cases to try to get accountability after the fact. So we've seen excessive force used by police departments across the country, using so-called less lethal weapons, whether it be tear gas or rubber bullets. So we've brought, at this point, probably dozens of cases, including in Minneapolis on behalf of a journalist who was hit by rubber bullets. We brought a case, it's got the amazing caption, Black Lives Matter versus Trump, about the confrontation that happened outside the White House when the president was trying to have a photo opportunity and cleared protesters with tear gas. He sued over that. So there are this whole universe of cases that are trying to get accountability after the fact, which is very difficult, but it's one way that you can try to protect protesters. And then I would just say the best way to empower communities to protest is not just to make sure the rules are fair, not just to make sure there's accountability after the fact, but also to listen to the messages. We all know that protest is a symptom, it's a method, but the real heart of the issue is about equality and freedom and empowerment. And I think that we can all take steps on the personal level, on the interpersonal level, as well as, you know, on the local level, the state level, and the national level, to really change ourselves and to change our communities to reflect the messages that are being portrayed, not just thinking about the methodology of protest. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Alice.
Thank you very much, Emerson. I'd now like to turn to Gift. Gift, you managed to link up. Wonderful, welcome. Could you just, before I ask you your question, just very briefly introduce yourself, because everybody else had done that?
Yes, my name is Gift Perez. I am the chairperson of the Humanist Defenders Coalition in Malawi. This is the coalition that led the electoral justice protest for 1 year. For the past of last year, up to now, we have been doing protests up to the extent that we have achieved that goal. We had elections and we have the new government now.
Thank you, Gift. You're going to be able to talk about that. I'm going to be asking you a specific question. There seemed to be a little bit of interference with the connection, so we'll keep our fingers crossed that it holds up. Now, Gift, yes. We know that within the context of COVID-19 around the world, there's been in quite a few countries a rolling back of some of our fundamental human rights, and in some cases, limitations of others. Some of the strategies which we've seen governments using have been to politicize the use of the law, sometimes militarize it, or securitize it. Which new protest tactics have you seen which have emerged or are emerging as civil society responds to this? What's the kind of innovation which is happening? Over to you, Gift.
Thank you.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it is important to note that COVID-19 came into the space in many countries when there was already human rights abuses, when in other countries there was already shrinking civic space. In the case of Malawi, I would say that COVID-19 came when we were deep into the struggle against electoral justice. The electoral justice protests that saw media freedom being curtailed, that saw attacks against human rights defenders. I was arrested 2 times during that struggle. But also COVID-19 came when we saw government attacking the judiciary. So it is important to take note that, like in the case of Malawi, COVID-19 came when the government was questioned in terms of its legitimacy. So any intervention against maybe COVID-19, it was looked at it from different angle altogether. I'll give an example. People were questioning even government interventions in terms of lockdown because they thought that the government was trying to run away from doing the elections. So it was a very difficult space. One, on the part of the government to come up with the interventions against COVID-19, because any intervention would be looked at as being political, being trying to run away from doing the elections. But as well, you have also to take into mind that even citizens were also demonstrating against the lockdown interventions that were introduced by the government. So we had a very challenging moment where you had a government that could not be respected by the citizens. At the same time, we wanted to protect citizens from getting COVID-19. What are the new ways? I would tell you that not to say that there were new ways, but I think as citizens, we had also to live with the reality. We had to live within those contexts that we were in. The most important thing that I noted is that we had very strong courts. Litigation is the one that saved us in terms of us enjoying the right to assembly. Every time we would want to do demonstrations, we had to go to court. The court is the one that protected the right to assembly in terms of getting court injunctions against government blocking the right to demonstrate. But also I think the other issue that I wanted also to comment is on when you have strong institutions, when the police has lost its mandate, we saw the army coming in. So we were able also to discuss with the army to make sure that the protesters are able to be protected, but also the lives and property of citizens, other citizens were also protected. I think the use of face masks and sanitizer was also a new thing to us. Remember, COVID-19 also came in the midst of a standstill of the country, where Malawians were, affected socio-economically over time. So it was also very hard, even in terms of resourcing, for us to get face masks or sanitizer. Even if you tell people to bring face masks or hand sanitizer, it was very challenging as well for people to buy on their own these materials, because we are a country that is poor, but as well many Malawians or even many citizens cannot afford even food on a daily basis. What more with buying face mask or sanitizer that can also protect citizens from getting COVID-19. But also I think we have also to say that I think for us, even the protests, I remember the last protest that we had against the impeachment of the Chief Justice, we had also to do messaging around COVID-19, the fight against COVID-19. It was also an important space for us to send the messages to citizens, because Malawians did not even believe that there is COVID-19, because by that time, as I said already, Malawians could not even trust the statistics that the government was communicating to the country, because every statistics that was being given was looked at as being political. They wanted to increase the statistics in order to shut down the country, in order the country not to have the elections. So it was also important for us to send the right message on COVID-19. But all in all, I have to say that I think it was very challenging because of the political context that we had, because the issues that we experienced were there before COVID-19 came into the equation, which also complicated our lives, our strategies. Up to now, it's also more challenging to do even protests, because as a civil society organization, you have to balance the two: the right to life, the right to health, and the other rights. I think we found ourselves in a very tricky situation in terms of how do we balance the two. Let me stop there for a moment.
Thank you very, very much, Gift. I'd now like to turn to Peter Mysic. When we talk about human rights and violations of rights, we always do recognize that the duty bearer has failed to carry out their responsibilities. But it looks as though there is a bit of hope on the horizon. And we'd like you, Peter, to tell us whether you've seen some good or promising government practices for ensuring that peaceful assembly during COVID-19 pandemic was in fact protected. 5 minutes, Peter.
You got it. And yeah, just want to extend my thank you to mandate of the Special Rapporteur and Clement N in particular for inviting us to join. We are really excited to speak on this topic, as Access Now is focused on the intersection of digital rights, which means human rights and technology. So we're focused on that intersection of where the human rights and security of users and communities at risk intersect with the digital age, with information and communications technologies and ICTs. And we got our start during the Green Movement in Iran. And so this street demonstrations and movements where people were using their phones with cameras on them for one of the first times and generating content, documenting a story and a narrative that might have contradicted the official story coming out of the government was the inception for our organization. And so it's really exciting to be able to work directly on this mandate. So we've seen that social distancing is in place during COVID-19. What that's done is forced us to decentralize, right, and stay, away from digital hubs, access points like schools and libraries and community centers, where there might be open exchange of information ideas, both in physical space as well as online, especially through Wi-Fi access points and hotspots and other ways that people do join together online. So in our separate spaces, we've been forced to re-strategize, equip ourselves and empower ourselves to recreate communities. And I think we've been quite successful. We see across the US, in New York City where I am, car and bike protests, and as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, as Emerson said, as well as the cheering for first responders and essential workers, like those in healthcare and other industries. Every night you'll see across the US and many other countries, a nightly cheer, and that's an offline manifestation, but often the videos are shared online, and that's how people kind of express their enthusiasm and come together to exercise their right to assemble in the digital age during this social distancing. Clement also mentioned the activist Greta Thunberg, who encouraged young activists who did grow up online to use the digital tools that the youth are familiar with to participate in a so-called digital strike. And so there you see the kind of spectrum from offline to online. It's not just a black or white, one or the other. It's often very fluid, this boundary, and we want to encourage that. So when it comes to government practice, it can be difficult to tell because non-interference can be a best practice for both protecting the rights and freedoms of all of us, as well as to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, as well as to economic, social, and cultural rights. So in 2019, we saw 213 internet shutdowns. That's the highest number we've ever seen. That is obviously not a good practice. It impacts people's ability to earn a livelihood as well as to express themselves and assemble. But there were many governments that must have chosen not to disrupt networks, not to shut down. They need to tell those stories of how they made that decision and why publicly, so we can have this debate and bring accountability to internet shutdowns. When they are shutting down the internet, bringing it back quickly is a best practice, announcing the legal justifications for the shutdown, the time limits, allowing challenges in court. And indeed, courts have stepped up. So as far as good government practice, courts in Indonesia and the West African Community Court in the last couple months during COVID have made landmark rulings against internet shutdowns in favor of the right to internet access, even during crises. Those are important to recognize. Governments can also proactively extend internet access. Efforts are underway to extend greater financing for internet infrastructure and access to affordable devices and services. Telecom companies and governments during and before demonstrations and events should roll out public access points and actually increase bandwidth. But governments must also prevent interference, whether by law enforcement or third parties, and hold accountable those who restrict rights. So ending internet shutdowns and the blocking of entire apps and services, ending the use of targeted spyware and mass indiscriminate facial recognition technology and surveillance. These are all key to ensuring that we can safely exercise our rights without fear of reprisal or chilling effects. And there have been efforts to hold police accountable, and these have largely been driven by video evidence. So allowing people to openly document and record demonstrations and police abuse, whether they're journalists or just ordinary citizens or first-time protesters, to upload those videos securely and often using privacy-enhancing technologies and to argue for accountability. This is an essential function of states to allow people to exercise their fundamental rights, to record and to upload safely and hopefully find accountability for the abuses that do take place. And I just want to say one last note that the international level has seen a positive response to both the protests and the COVID distancing. So we've seen the African group lead at the Human Rights Council a resolution against systemic racism and police violence against persons of African descent. We've also seen in this Human Rights Council session efforts by the Swiss and others to advance the right to protest, acknowledging the deep need we have to assemble even in the midst of crises like COVID. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Peter. At this point, I'd like to turn to Barbara Fontana, who is from the Swiss Permanent Mission. Barbara, if you would introduce yourself and then present the peaceful protest resolution. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me at this webinar this afternoon. So my name is Barbara Fontana. I'm head of the Human Rights section here at the Permanent Mission of Switzerland. And I've been working on the initiative on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of peaceful protests since it was first launched in June 2011. So it's been a while. Currently, this initiative is carried by Costa Rica and Switzerland. We are currently at HRC 44. We came with a new text. It was based on the resolution that was adopted 2 years ago, which was adopted by consensus. And we have tried to take into account recent developments over the past couple of years, whether it is like referencing the guidance on less lethal weapons, as many have already made reference to those, but obviously the main topic of this webinar being COVID-19, so the exceptional measures that have been taken, and of course the resolution 2 years ago asked for a report. And it was a report on new technology. So we've looked at all these things. For us, it was important to come with a new text because it's a continued relevance. We have obviously already seen all these protests in 2019. Earlier this year, we had a joint statement at HRC 43, which was co-sponsored by a total of 53 states from all regions. And obviously, protesters have continued to take to the streets, whether in relation to measures taken in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, despite restrictions, or in the context of events in the US and the Black Lives Matter movement that prompted the urgent debate during the resumed session here in June. Basically, events around the world prompted us to come with a new substantive text. What we have to bear in mind is that it was launched during the so-called Arab Spring, but yet since the beginning we followed the thematic approach to make it relevant to every context, wherever peaceful protest may emerge and for whatever reason. And the text obviously has evolved over time to the point now that I'm told that it's way too long, but there are always new elements to consider as this resolution is not just about the right to peaceful assembly. Gathering, whether in physical space or online, put into play so many different human rights, and we've seen that already with a joint report that we had asked at the time from Mina Kai, who was then Special Rapporteur on Peaceful Assembly and Association, and Christoph Heinz, who was Special Rapporteur on Summary Executions, and we see it also from the recent report on new technologies that was prepared by the office. One aspect that hasn't changed in the approach that we've had here at the Council is that basically the text is about the international obligations and commitments of states. And we are convinced that listening to individuals' grievances as they take to the streets and the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms are the best ways to prevent violations and abuses from taking place in the... So our main additions this year have focused... The impact, sorry, bit of a public place. The impact, basically we focused more on the impact, positive and negative of new technologies, on the protection and promotion of human rights in the context of assemblies, based amongst other things on the report of the OECHR, but also we focused on the respect of international human rights obligations in the management of assemblies in times of emergencies, including, of course, the COVID-19 crisis. But the text also has a lot of things, reference to the guidance, reference to the Minnesota Protocol, reference now to less lethal weapons and the misuse. It is quite a substantive text, and we're really hopeful that we will be able to have a consensus again. We do have 3 amendments that have been tabled. We don't know yet their fate, but basically 2 of them are about obligations or duties and responsibilities of organizers and leaders of protests. And so obviously we have some difficulties in knowing how we will handle those, but we are confident that we will end up in a situation where we will be able to defeat those amendments if they are maintained and submitted to a vote, and that the whole text will be adopted by consensus. I've spoken too long. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And since they're going to close and kick us out, I should let this online gathering continue its natural course. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Barbara. We appreciate it. We've had some questions coming in. So what we're going to do now is turn to the questions which have been sent in by participants, and then wrap up at the end with the common question which would have been presented right now, because we can see, I'd really like us to try and give time to participant questions. Question number 1 is from Amnesty International in Togo to Clement. Badia, could you please read out the question?
Yes, thank you very much, Alice. So the first question comes from Amnesty International Togo, from MA. It is addressed to Clement. Do you see any trends of restrictions during COVID-19 pandemic and other reasons such as terrorism being used in some regions such as West Africa? This is the first part of the question. And the second part is, apart from the Special Rapporteur's appeal, do you see any other mechanisms that we can request a judgment on these kinds of restrictive laws? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Alice. And I think, thank you also for the MA from the Amnesty International for this question. Yes, one thing that I want also to refer me to is my 10 principle, where I also explain some of the trends that we witness in terms of the restriction of the civic space, but also importantly, the right to peaceful assembly. If we go in the context of West Africa, where it is also mentioned clearly, we are also seeing currently also the ongoing protests in Mali, which I'm really concerned about, but also recently the arrest of some leaders, civil society leaders in Niger, based on the fact that they have broken the COVID-19 rules. So I think there is this trend that is coming up in all of the country, not just West Africa. The year before, we know that one of the main reasons where many governments use to kind of restrict the right for people to protest was the act of the terrorism, where they always qualified protesters as being terrorist groups protesting. But this year, we know that it's so easy for government to prevent people to protest and enjoy the support of the international community, because one of the arguments will be the health issue. But we are also seeing at the same time that most of these governments are lifting the restriction for work, the restriction for businesses, and many restrictions, but at the same time, the one that is not really lifted is a gathering. And because this is not seen as by many governments like an essential part of the governance, that's the problem. And we are also seeing that in many countries, if I take the example of Africa, elections are coming up. And there is no lift of this restriction, but we know that some of the countries are planning to really hold their election on the date that is planned. And the question then is that, can the election be held while there is no possibility for political parties to be able to meet with their supporters, to be able also to campaign? And this is why exactly, referring to that, we are advocating today to say that while this COVID-19 can take us a while, we don't know, it depends on vaccine, it depends on how things will move, it's important to find new way, to find a way that government can allow protests, and like German, now the decision of the courts in German, like in many cities, allowing protests to happen, but also being able to sensitize them on health regulation, on health measure, which is the distancing, if possible. If it's not possible, wearing the mask or being able to wash your hand when you go back home. And I think it's because it's shown, mainly currently, it's not because there is restriction on COVID that people will not come out to speak. That's the problem. People will come out. So how do we make sure that when they come out and when they speak, they are able to respect the rule? I think the government needs to take the proactive measure to ensure that people can protest, but when they respect this. And when you take this proactive measure, people understand and people will be able to cooperate with government. And then the second aspect, I think that there are so many. The African Commission is also there, the Human Rights Committee. You can also seize all of this body. If you think that the measure taken by your country is not to fight COVID, is not in line with the international standard, that those measures than fighting COVID is now restricting the fundamental freedoms. You can also issue, or you can also contact, or you can also file your case before regional courts. ECOWAS court is there, African Commission is there, Human Rights Committee is there, but also we as mandate holders, we are also there to be able also to convene your message to your government. Thank you.
Thank you. The second question is for Emerson from Ona. Badia?
Thank you very much. So the question asked is, does the ACLU use international norms and standards on freedom of assembly, including those developed by UNSR and recommendations of country visits, in litigation before the US domestic courts? If so, what has been the impact?
Thanks very much, and apologies, my 3-year-old also wants to chime in on this, so I don't know if you can hear him in the background, but I'm just gonna keep pushing through. But so, you know, it's a great question from Ona, my former colleague. I think she's at ECNL. But as you deal of patience for introducing international law in domestic suits. The good news is that our constitution and our modern jurisprudence around freedom of assembly and freedom of speech is actually quite good. Usually what we're trying to do is make sure that local ordinances and local laws abide by the constitutional norms. So we have a quite strong reference point in our own constitution, but unfortunately, it's usually not in our strategic interest before judges to present international legal arguments. That said, my background being in international human rights, I insist on starting everything with the fact that the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly are fundamental human rights guaranteed to all people in all places. And so I think that that's a really useful point to start with, especially as you may know, the ACLU is famous for defending the speech rights even of people who we vehemently disagree with. We've represented white supremacists, KKK members, neo-Nazis, all sorts of folks to make the point that all people have the right to freedom of speech. Of course, they don't have the right to act on that speech if it's criminal or if it's harassment or if it's physical violence or anything like that. But we do think that even controversial ideas must be protected. And we use the precedent that was set by these cases defending these people we disagree with also to defend the people we agree with. And that's something that we do on a daily basis. So in those discussions, when I'm trying to convince our allies why it's worth our time and energy to protect the rights of these people who we are fighting against in all sorts of other ways, I always start with the fact that these are human beings. They have rights under international human rights law, under their constitution. And we have to always keep in mind as we're doing this work, one, that everybody has equal rights, and two, everybody has the capacity to change. And so while we might disagree with someone now, we've all changed our minds, even on big, important things. And so we have to remember that other people, even people we disagree with, also have the capacity to change their mind. So it's a great question from Ona. Unfortunately, we're not able to usually cite, Clement in our filings in state court or even in federal court, as much as I would like to do so. I argue with my colleagues all the time, trying to convince them to let me do it. But it certainly informs our work, and it's sort of, at least for me personally, the foundation of why I do this work.
Thank you very much, Emerson. Question 3 is from Renee for both Gift and Clement. Over to you, Badia.
So question number 3 has 2 parts, one part addressed to Gift and the second part addressed to Clement. The question is, what's the best way to address the claim that when protesters, for example, in Hong Kong or the US, use violence, then it is justified for police to use force and for governments to shut down the protest? What advice does the UNSR have for protesters against injustice who find it necessary to express their anger and frustration by engaging in acts of riot, fighting back the police, and burning buildings, for example? Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Can I come to or Gibbs first? Okay. No, I think this is. This is a question that really summarizes our contemporary challenge. You will agree with me, and which is also one of the arguments that is used in most of the cases to prevent protests, to criminalize protests, or to repress protests. But one thing that I'm saying is that we need to keep in mind that the right to protest is a fundamental right. That's why under the international norm, the protest is protected as a peaceful protest. And if you assume that the protest is a fundamental right, you can compare the protest as it is with violent protest. Because whenever the protest, and I want this to be clear, is not because two people within the protest are becoming violent that make these rights irrelevant. These rights still relevant because people gather to exercise their rights. Imagine if we end by saying that in a protest, if one person starts breaking the window, this protest must be declared violent and must become irrelevant and must be dispersed. It means that every time that one person who disagree with the message that people want to convey through the message can just introduce himself in the protest and then stop the protest. So I always argue with the government and to say this is the role of the security forces. Then whenever there is a violent element in the protest, security forces have the right to ensure that they extract those violent elements in order to leave the protest to go on. Because if you don't do it like that, what you are trying to say is that you are compromise all of the protests by saying that because one person commits act of violence, all of us are responsible for this violence. And you are now creating this incentive of violence because then every time that people go on the street, they're still waiting. They say, oh, police will come. They will show us. But you need to create this kind of environment where people feel like the police is there to help them to continue their protest, to guarantee their life, to guarantee the life, the property of others. And for the protest, and I'm saying always, and I put that, when you express your view through this violence, through the riots, you are diminishing your message. Your message is not getting through. You need to ensure that your protest, you need also to ensure that whenever you protest and whenever there is act of violence, you need really to distinguish yourself from this act of violence, because what the violence is doing is it gives argument to the government to repress you, but also it gives also argument to the society to say this, every time that people want to protest, they say, no, this protest is always violent. And I think this is what I can give as really advice, but also trying to say that it's important that we don't mix up by trying to say that because few people becoming violent in the protest, that the protest is no longer, has to be dispelled, the protest is no longer relevant. No, this is fundamental right. Every individual exercises this right, and every individual should be held accountable for his act of violence.
Badia, did you say that the second part of that question was different for Gift, or is it the same?
Exactly, no. It is addressed to Gift.
Okay, maybe I'll just come in on the issue of violence. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think our experience has been that during the demonstrations, I think we have experienced that some violence is sponsored by the opposing side. There are some agencies or agents of the opposing side who are always against the protests. So they would sponsor violence in order to have justification to stop demonstrations. I think we have experienced that after your demonstration, sometimes you are done with your demonstrations, but after that, there are elements of violence way after your demonstrations. And most of those cases are done just to tarnish the image of the organizers of those demonstrations. But what I've seen working is that I think when you collaborate quite well with the security agencies in terms of planning the demonstrations, but as well knowing the elements of violence as to who are maybe the agents of those violence cases, I think it comes better on the side of the organizers to manage elements of violence. But also sometimes the problem is the security agencies. When the police has lost trust from the citizens by siding the government, even not defending the rule of law, it becomes so much challenging for the security agencies to defend or to protect.
It would appear as though Gift has had a problem with the internet connectivity. So I suggest
the lives of the demonstrating citizen. So in Malawi, where the police, yes, I'm just finishing. I've seen in the case of Malawi that the police was politicized in terms of how they handled the rule of law. So Malawians were against the police because they were not standing on the rule of law. And for us as organizers, we brought in the military to help the police to make sure that we have peaceful demonstrations. So sometimes it's the behavior of the security agencies that also angers the protesters.
Thank you very much, Gift. The fourth question is from Tinza for Peter. Over to you, Badia.
The question is, access to internet plays a key role in COVID-19 period, but in Myanmar, internet shutdown impacting 1 million people has been placed for more than a year now. How as international community we can ensure and pressure Myanmar to lift the shutdown ASAP?
Thanks. That's a great question. This shutdown is a terrible imposition, vulnerable in Myanmar. The shutdown is a direct violation of human rights and enables further violations when people aren't able to document abuses and share information with the global community. So again, this shutdown must end. Civil society has spoken clearly. We've issued statements that I just put in the chat on the 1-year anniversary of the shutdown, calling for it to end. To be clear, every stakeholder has a role in ending this trend of internet shutdowns, and specifically the shutdown in Myanmar. But I want to start off by saying something positive, which is that it appears that Myanmar's government is feeling pressure. They've shared a document justifying the shutdown and the internet restrictions, and put out that document and then shared it with all the UN missions in Geneva, all the other states. And that's a first time I've seen that step. It's bold, and it, I think, shows that the government sees that it's on weak footing and acting against the rule of law, and is trying to justify its position. And so we need to continue the pressure. First, make internet access universal. Reach the Sustainable Development Goal Target 9C, which says that all those in least developed countries should have internet access by 2020. It literally has this year in the sub-target. We need to make this universal. Internet access is essential to achieving our human rights in the digital age. Demand answers to the civil society letter that I put in the chat that many groups have joined. Call out Myanmar in international forums, and not just the Human Rights Council, not just through OHCHR statements, which are of course important, but at international development bodies, at the World Bank, at the IMF, in trade negotiations. Why? Because shutdowns hurt economies. Shutdowns hurt people's ability to transact through their phones, to engage in e-commerce, and ultimately they create uncertainty when it comes to the stability of a country's digital economy. And for that reason, investors and investing in the state should understand the impact of internet shutdowns, quantify their impacts on economic development. Telecoms companies operating there, and there are international telecoms operating in Myanmar, should push back against shutdown orders, should require them be in writing and follow the law, follow the right procedure, and document all of the shutdowns that they are executing. They need to lobby for the rule of law. A couple other ideas at the UN, the Secretary General's office, or maybe this new technology envoy or UNESCO should count every single shutdown that happens in the world. Document these just like UNESCO documents the killing of journalists. These events do impact people's lives when they can't access, for instance, health information during the COVID pandemic. Also, we can isolate Myanmar by stopping shutdowns elsewhere. Many governments are joining this trend. Act locally by passing a law against shutdowns in your city or state. And I just want to say one more thing about acting locally, and that's to act against the trade in spyware and surveillance tech. So, Myanmar, like pretty much every other government, is probably looking at how it can better surveil protesters and enforce biometric recognition, like facial recognition technologies. By bringing accountability locally, like we've done in New York City by passing the Post Act against police use of surveillance tech, and in many other cities, you will aid this global fight and help to isolate those bad actors, like Myanmar often is. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. This session ends at 4:30, and so at this stage, I'd like to thank everyone who's sent in their questions. We're now going to move to the last question. I'm going to turn back to the entire panel and ask them to reflect on two lessons. Which two lessons have we learned about the protection of the right to peaceful assembly during crises? And I will not ask Clement to speak now because he'll then speak during the closing remarks. Okay, so I'd like to start off with Beatriz, please. Could you share two lessons which you've learned about the protection of the right to peaceful assembly during crises? Thank you.
Thank you. I think one important lesson that we are learning in the pandemic is in times of social isolation, there is a very important need for digital and technological inclusion programs. For example, in my country, Venezuela, we have the lowest internet. We are on the bottom. According to a speed test, in terms of internet speed in Venezuela is the country with the lowest internet connection in Latin America. Only Algeria and Afghanistan have a slower internet connection than Venezuela. And if we don't have the access to the digital space of internet, it's very difficult for civil society or for citizens to organize and to exercise their rights. And secondly, it's important to find another ways to document and to ask for our rights. In this moment, it's mandatory the social isolation. We cannot be quiet. We still, as a civil society, working and demanding our rights, and it's important to show what is happening in countries as a Venezuela that is a not democratic country, and also keep asking for elections, that the elections cannot be, and the democracy cannot be suspended, should be a right, and the state and the community international has to push for that. Thank you.
Gracias, Beatriz. Emerson, 2 lessons.
Sure. I'll do you one better. I'll do one lesson. And my quick lesson to close is just that protests can work. We've seen a lot of pessimism, a lot of frustration with the current state of the world. But with the massive mobilization that we've seen in the US, of course, we've seen backlash. We've seen backlash from the White House. We've seen backlash from a variety of sectors. And sometimes the actions that are taken are more symbolic than substantive. You know, painting Black Lives Matter on the street or something like that. Some people have said that's empowering. Others have said it's just mere symbolism. But at the same time, we've seen that the public conversation really has changed in the United States. People are talking about options and reforms that seemed fanciful just a few months ago. So the real public debate has changed, and we've seen action on the local level. The most dramatic example might be in Minneapolis, where in the wake of George Floyd's death, the city council decided to fundamentally rethink how they formulate their police department, to reorient towards community policing. So just a word of encouragement that you know, change is possible and change is happening, and protest works.
Thank you very much, Emerson. Over to you, Gift. 2 lessons. Gift, please unmute your mic. Unmute your mic.
Yes, I've done that. Yeah, my first lesson is that oppressive governments always want to curtail the rights of its own citizens during the time of crisis. I think it needs citizens to stand up, not to allow government to curtail the rule of law, even in the midst of crisis like COVID-19. The second, I think, learning that I've seen is that when we have a very progressive judiciary, it also strengthens the space in terms of to protect the rights of citizens to assembly, the right to protest. I think we need also strong governance institutions in the country to make sure that the rights of citizens are able to be protected in times of crisis like this.
Thank you very much, Gift. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks. So I do want to emphasize again that the need to integrate, as the Special Rapporteur has said, economic, social, and cultural rights into our conception of the right to peaceful assembly and association. I think when we see the impacts of the economic downturn that's taking hold, we'll see a lot of people losing the access that they had to ICTs, to those devices or services, or again, the schools or offices or institutions where they usually would go to find affordable access. And we need to ensure that people are able to afford and get that. And that's often not just about affordability, but again, vulnerable and marginalized communities in patriarchal societies, women and girls are often intentionally deprived of opportunities to access ICTs. And so again, those are essential to the exercise of this right in the digital age. And then, just to note that the tactics do evolve, right? Young people are doing amazing things, whether it's in Hong Kong with the use of protests to stop the facial recognition, or these K-pop fans who have organized around a Trump rally in the United States to disrupt that online. And I think those tactics continue to evolve, but the legal protections must stay abreast and must stay vigilant. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. Over to you, Monsieur Voule.
Thank you very much, Alice. I want to thank all of you for this great panel, and also some of the good questions that we received, and your very brilliant moderation, Alice, and also thank to all of the co-sponsor. I just wanted to make some quick remark for the end. As you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, this panel is all within the celebration of the 10th anniversary. And we know, and you agree with me from what we hear, that we are also living in challenging time where this right is under pressure, where this right is misunderstood, where this right is completely curtailed. And I want also to say that while we are heading to the difficult time, which will be the impact of what we are foreseeing for the next year in terms of the COVID, where we will also be seeing the increase of the protests. Let's see that. It's not that we wish to have it, but we know that next year will be so difficult in terms of the protests. I want also to really highlight that government to need to make a best and a good choice of governance in creating conducive and environment for people to exercise peacefully this right. And from my experience is whenever you're trying to restrict people, whenever you're trying to suppress the right, when people have the possibility to exercise it, they exercise it beyond what you can believe. So it's better to allow and create this environment where people can exercise it freely, because we need to understand, and I appeal for you to help us to spread this word, that the protest is a democratic means, is a means for people to participate in public affairs, is a means for people to contribute to the construction of the state, for development. So the protest is a way for people to be able also to express their long grievance whenever those are not solved. The protest is also a way for community to ensure that their leaders are aware about the challenge they are facing. So we need to understand this. And this protest, like I mentioned at the beginning, it helps us to free all of us. This humanity is what is today, thanks to the people that stood up, thanks to our ancestors that stood up to claim their freedom. We cannot today suppress this right. And it's particular in the time of the crisis that this right is really important. Because it helps people to come, to express themselves, to contribute, to make their voice heard. It helps people to not choose the violent means, but to choose the peaceful means. So I want you really in this campaign to help us and to ensure that all of the governments understand this. And I want to end by saying that it's important that in this context, where we are heading in this difficult time, the role that civil society will be playing is crucial. Because no government will be able to mitigate this crisis alone without the support of the civil society, without ensuring that community are able to tell what they are facing, what they need, and without ensuring that community can participate. So no government will be able to mitigate. Let us ensure that this right is understood as a democratic mean, but it is understood as a way for all of us to build the better world to live. And I hope, and I continue to hope, that there is so many governments around the world that understand this message and want to support. We need, as a community, we need as civil society to strategize, to ensure that the right to protest is understood well as a way to construct the community, not to destroy. When I hear many people saying that This is disturbing for development. This is disturbing our security. It's sad because this is the right that liberates many countries. This is the right that people enjoy to build their country. So please continue to help us to spread the word. And I hope that you will be joining us for other webinars to continue to express our view on many topics. And thank you. And you were really brilliant, all of you. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you very, very much, Monsieur Voule. It is now 4:30. All I'll say is to say what has been made very clear is in the midst of all the challenges and the crises, there are opportunities. And I think ultimately it's been a very optimistic webinar. It's been one of hope. It's been one of recognizing new ways of working. And I'd just like to say, thank you very much. Empowerment remains central. Freedom of peaceful assembly and association remains central, not only to democracy, sustainable development, participation, accountability, but to ensure that civil society organizations and communities remain meaningful participants in the destiny of their own lives. Merci beaucoup. Gracias. Au revoir. Thank you. Goodbye.